Hello, it's Amy, and I'm back once again with the Memoirs of the Princesse de Ligne. And we are beginning with Chapter 7 today. Chapter 7 of Volume 1, beginning on page 153. My intimacy with Madame de Choiseul increased day by day. We had everything in common, our books, our trinkets, and even the keys of our drawers and writing desks were mutually in each other's possessions. It happened about that time that Mademoiselle de Levis one day publicly taunted Mademoiselle de Choiseul before the whole class with the fact of her mother's being kept in confinement on account of her having been in love with an actor. Mademoiselle de Choiseul, although very angry, was not disconcerted, and said, "No, my mother lives in the country, because she prefers it. At least that is what I have always been told. But if what you say be true, it will not be the most commendable action on your part to have enlightened me on the subject." The whole class was exceedingly irritated with Mademoiselle de Levis, and all the young ladies told her that her conduct was infamous, that no one could be reproached for a thing of that kind, that they were in despair at its having happened to their class, and that they would ask as a favor for her removal back into the blue class in consideration of her own honor, since the more she was treated like a child, the more excusable her behavior would be. Then Mademoiselle de Levis sought out Mademoiselle de Choiseul, who was in a corner of the classroom, and, being mean-spirited, knelt down before her and begged her not to repeat this story. All the young ladies of her class followed and hooted her. Mademoiselle de Choiseul replied aloud, "Mademoiselle, all that I can do for you is not to mention your name, and I give you my word of honor that it shall not pass my lips. But I should be condemned forever in the eyes of my companions if I appeared unconcerned after what you have told me in their presence, and if I did not seek information about my mother from my relatives." At that moment a mistress, who had noticed that during the last hour the disturbance among the pupils, she came forward and asked what had happened. Mademoiselle de Choiseul said that she had had a dispute with one of the pupils, and that it was now over. The mistress asked if anyone had a complaint to make, and we remained silent. She returned to her seat. Mademoiselle de Choiseul and I afterwards held a consultation in order to see what steps she should take, and we decided that she must speak of this event to Madame de Rouchart. I asked Mademoiselle de Choiseul if she had had no suspicion of what she had been taunted with, and she said, "No, I fancied that my mother was a peculiar woman and was disliked by her family, and that was her reason for preferring to live in the country." She also added, "Neither my father nor my uncle ever mentioned her to me, and when occasionally have spoken of her, I noticed that the subject was distasteful. But now that I recall a host of other things said before me, I am afraid what Mademoiselle de Levis told me is true." Then she added, "I am suffocating, I feel an imperative need to weep, and am controlling myself here." I went to Mother Quatre-Temps and asked her to allow me to go to Madame de Rouchart, as I had something to say to her, and she gave me the permission. Mademoiselle de Choiseul, on her side, went to Madame de Saint-Pierre, who, being very strict, replied that she might wait to see Madame de Rouchart till the names were called over in the evening. Choiseul, who was very quick-tempered, could bear it no longer and burst into tears. Madame de Saint-Pierre said she was out of temper and ordered her to go and kneel down. She obeyed. All the pupils pitied her and made much of her. They told Levis that she was the cause of all this trouble. She had remained in a corner of the room, not daring to show herself. Mademoiselle de Choiseul said to me in a low voice, "As you have permission, go to Madame de Rouchart, tell her my trouble, and beg her to send for me. But do not mention Levis, as I have promised not to do so." I therefore ran off to Madame de Rouchart. I did not find her in her cell, but only Madame de Saint-Delphine, who said to me, "Ah, it is you, my pussy. I am very glad to see you, for I was feeling as dull as a dog waiting for my sister. Tell me something amusing, I beg of you, for I am exceedingly low spirits." And then I said to Madame de Saint-Delphine, "Mademoiselle de Choiseul and I have something to tell Madame de Rouchart, but she has not obtained permission to come. If you would be so kind as to send for her by Sister Leonard, saying that Madame de Rouchart asks for her, it would not be a lie, as it is also your name." She consented, and shortly after Madame de Rouchart came in. Mademoiselle de Choiseul arrived at the same moment, and we told Madame de Richard what had taken place. She appeared most indignant, and said, "Who said such a thing?" She inquired. We absolutely refused to tell her. Thereupon, Madame de Richard, who did not wish to commit herself with Madame de Choiseul, said, "I have withdrawn myself from the world, and events of this kind do not reach us. But tell me which member of your family you wish me to write to, who may be able to give you some explanations." Mademoiselle de Choiseul named her aunt, the Duchess de Gramont. And we have here a footnote. Beatrix de Choiseul Stainville, born in Luneville in 1730, she was canoness of Remiremont, and had no other income but that derived from her prebendary. She was ambitious, and united to a stern and hard character, a masculine intellect capable of grappling with affairs and intrigues. She soon formed the project of ruling her brother. For this purpose a great name and a large fortune were indispensable. Moreover, the man who would bring her these advantages was bound to be a mere cipher in order not to overshadow the Duc de Choiseul. She found all these requisites united in the person of the Duc de Gramont, whom she married the 16th of August, 1759. The Duchess de Gramont's influence over her brother became absolute, to the great despair of the Duchess de Choiseul, who was devoted to her husband and found herself supplanted by her domineering sister-in-law. End of footnote. Madame de Richard accordingly wrote to her. She came the next day, and Mademoiselle de Choiseul, having told her the cause of her trouble, Madame de Gramont replied, "I do not wish to deceive you. You are now growing up, and cannot be left in a state of ignorance that might lead you to make injudicious remarks. It is quite true that your mother's misconduct has obliged her family to place her in a convent. You have a sister," and we have a footnote here, "you have a sister, Therese Felicity de Choiseul Stanville, born in 1767, married in 1767, born in 1767, married in 1782, the Prince Grimaldi Monaco. From contemporary accounts, she appears to have been pretty and endowed with a captivating personality." Oh goodness. She was guillotined in 1793. "You have a sister who has been brought up in another convent, and who is coming to be with you at the Abbaye aux Bois. Your demeanour towards the pupils must be sufficiently authoritative to prevent anyone broaching the subject in future, and above all, have no confidants. You can easily imagine that this is not an agreeable topic of conversation for your father. Do not therefore mention it to him unless he be the first to speak to you." And I know this was published, or written, this memoir was probably, penned for publication much later in life, but it doesn't seem a very honest or friendly move to be relaying these events that Mademoiselle de Choiseul's family told her to keep to herself, and evidently Mademoiselle de Choiseul told our Princess de Ligne here, and the Princess de Ligne has decided that these events are hers to relay to the public. But moving on, Mademoiselle de Choiseul asked if she would not be allowed to write to her mother. Madame de Gramont said that she could not take upon herself to give her that permission, but that she would speak of it to her family. And so this implies that Mademoiselle de Choiseul has not really grown up knowing her mother, perhaps has not met her mother, at least since she was a very, very little girl, and that's unfortunate, and that's a little bit sad here, and it does seem to be very much the norm here for these young ladies to, these young ladies of nobility to be growing up without certainly daily, without consistent or frequent contact with their family members. Mademoiselle de Choiseul came and told me all this, and we agreed that we would appear to have forgotten what had taken place, and that if the others referred to it, we should show our displeasure. Unfortunately, Mademoiselle de Levis' cruel gossip was but too well-founded, and the romantic adventures of Madame de Stanville, especially the final catastrophe, had created a great scandal. When the Duc de Choiseul became war minister at the death of the Marshal de Belle-Île, he had his brother, the Count Jacques de Choiseul-Stanville, named lieutenant general. The Count had no fortune. His family, wishing to secure for him a brilliant match, turned their thoughts to Mademoiselle Therese de Clermont-Revel, who was a great heiress and endowed with a charming presence. The Duke cleverly conducted the negotiations, and the marriage was decided upon. The Count was nearly 40 years old. His betrothed was only 15, and had never seen her future husband. He obtained leave of absence, came to Paris, and 6 hours after his arrival the marriage was celebrated. And the footnote says on the 3rd of April, 1761. The young Countess de Stainville was presented in society by her sister-in-law, the Duchess de Choiseul, and created quite a sensation. She danced like an angel and shone with grace and beauty. It was easy to suppose that before long she would receive attentions from the most fashionable men. Contemporary memoirs even pretend that her brother-in-law, the Duc de Choiseul, dared to hazard a declaration, which was badly received. It is said that Lauzun fared better, but this passing fancy was shortly superseded by another sentiment. It is well known how actors were then run after in society. Their conquests were innumerable, and at that time Clerval was the actor most in vogue and the favourite of all the ladies. He united to undoubted talent, a handsome face, an elegant figure, and a natural audacity which nothing could check. He was not long in perceiving the impression that he had made on Madame de Stainville, and determined to risk all and take advantage of it. A lady's maid and a footman were taken into the secret, and Madame de Stainville even went so far as to receive Clerval at her own residence. And a footnote, she had left the Choiseul family mansion and was living at number 7 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Some time passed. Madame de Stainville had gave birth to a second daughter, and nothing foreshadowed the scandal that was about to take place. But the intimacy between Clerval and the Countess was gradually becoming known. The Duchess de Gramont was the first to hear of it. She hated her young sister-in-law, and was not slow to inform her brother of the rumours, which, till then, he had ignored. The Count was away on military service with the army, and was to return to be present at an entertainment in which all Paris was interested. The Marshal de Mirepoix was preparing a wonderful fancy ball at the Hotel de Broncas. National dances were to be performed by 24 gentlemen and by as many ladies in Chinese and Indian costumes. These were being rehearsed for the last week. The guilty and unfortunate Madame de Stainville, says Madame du Deffand, had Prince de Hennin for a partner, and was present every day at these rehearsals. On Tuesday, 2 days before the ball, all the dancers were entertained at a supper given by the Duchess de Valentinois. It was noticed that Madame de Stainville seemed very dejected and constantly had tears in her eyes. Her husband had arrived that morning. On the following day, Wednesday, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Madame de Stainville was carried off in a post-chaise and conducted by her husband in person to the convent of the Filles de Sainte Marie at Nancy. The Count had easily obtained a lettre de cachet through his brother the Duke, and his wife was confined for the rest of her life. He returned her all her fortune, and had a trustee appointed who was authorized to give the Countess everything she required, but not a farthing in money. A sum was devoted to her daughter's maintenance, and the remainder of her income put under sequestration for their benefit. The lady's maid was sent to the Salpêtrière, and the footman to Bicêtre as a punishment for having aided in the affair. It was generally considered that Monsieur de Stainville had inflicted on his wife a chastisement of unheard of severity. In those days of easy morality, it was not the custom to consider this sin as an unpardonable offence, and the beautiful Madame de Stainville excited a universal feeling of pity. It was even said that the Count's mistress, a young and charming actress at the opera, notified to him on his return from Nancy that she would never see him again for fear of being taken for an accomplice in such an iniquitous proceeding. And here's a footnote. The time came, however, when, thanks to the efforts of the Duchess de Choiseul, Madame de Stainville's home was again open to her, but she refused to return and died in the convent in great piety. What a double standard and what a piece of work. Some time after this sad revelation, Mademoiselle de Choiseul, very much agitated, came to Helene as she was leaving the parlour and said to her, "Fancy, they are going to put my sister at the Abbaye aux Bois, and she will arrive next Monday. What distresses me is that she is simply sent to the dormitory whilst I have my own apartment. This difference is certain to make the pupils talk." Helene advised her to say that it had been considered proper to make this difference on account of her being the eldest. She told me she was to go out the next day and make her sister's acquaintance, as she had never seen her. She went out accordingly, and as she was late in returning, we were not able to talk together in private. But in the evening she came into my room and told me that her sister was 4 years younger than herself and a mere child, that she was rather pretty but did not appear very lively. She thought her ignorant and badly brought up, that she had made a great deal of her, but that she had appeared very untamed. She also told me that she was called Mademoiselle de Stanville. We decided to notice her a great deal in order that no unpleasantness should occur when she was received. She was brought to the convent by Madame la Duchesse de Choiseul, who gave instructions that she should be appealed to for all requirements, being specially in charge, instead of her father or the Duchesse de Gramont, as was the case for Mademoiselle de Choiseul. It is evident that the kindness of the Duchesse de Choiseul did not belie itself, and that she was determined to act the part of a mother to the forsaken child, whom everyone seemed to repel. Monsieur Dufour de Chervagny, in his Memoirs, says that the Duc de Choiseul, having severely reprimanded his sister-in-law on account of her intimacy with Clerval, the Countess had solemnly declared that the child she had just given birth to was a legitimate daughter of the Count. Mademoiselle de Choiseul presented her to the class, saying that she was her sister, and that she begged every one to behave kindly towards her. Then Mesdemoiselles de Conflans, Mademoiselle de Damas, and myself went up to her and made a great deal of her. But she was very shy and received us very coldly. As soon as she had made some acquaintances, Choiseul left her and never became very intimate with her, for there was a great difference between the two sisters. When the Duc de Choiseul, Madame de Stanville, and Madame la Duchesse de Gramont came to see Mademoiselle de Choiseul, they never asked for Mademoiselle de Stanville. But Mademoiselle de Choiseul insisted, and said she would not go down to the parlour if her sister was not also asked for. So they were obliged to see Mademoiselle de Stanville. It was the same thing about going out. Mademoiselle de Choiseul would never go by herself to the Hôtel de Choiseul. And we have a footnote. The family mansion of the Choiseuls was at No. 3 Rue de la Grange Batelière, and occupied the site of the former opera house. The gardens and outer buildings extended as far as the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin. The Opera Comique, burnt down in May 1887, was built on land belonging to the Duc de Choiseul. We can hardly realize at present the size and importance of the hotels of the 18th century, many of which were regular palaces. The little hotel of Madame de Gramont was next to her brother's. And we're using this term hotel, but I don't think it means what we would think it means when we say hotel. A hotel seems to be being used, as some sort of substitute for a grand house, I suppose. Where are we at? Yes. And all this was from a generous and kindly feeling, as she did not care for her sister, but she would not allow herself any distinction which might be to her disadvantage. Mademoiselle de Choiseul's generous conduct under these circumstances proves a nobility of character most uncommon in a child of 14. No doubt the exalted opinion these young girls had of their rank and their birth contributed to develop sentiments of honor and refinement. They practiced the axiom noblesse oblige to the full extent, and to say that they had a base mind was to them the bitterest reproach. But at the same time it must be acknowledged that they had the greatest contempt for anyone who did not belong to their caste. Helene expresses herself on this point in the most ingenious manner. At one time, she tells us, there was a breach in the walls of the convent while the garden wall was being rebuilt. It is the custom, whenever there is a breach in the enclosure, for the rules of seclusion to be set aside for as long a time as the breach lasts. This wall separated the convent on one side from the street, whilst on the other side lay the convent of the Petite Cordelière, so that now, there being a way open, the nuns were able to visit each other. The convent of the Petite Cordelière was neither as large nor as fine a building as ours. They only received about 30 pupils, but they were not young ladies of good birth, and they were very much embarrassed when they saw our numerous classes entirely composed of the daughters of the best families of France. At that time, on returning to the convent one evening, Mademoiselle de Choiseul said she had a great event to tell me. She said she was going to marry the son of Monsieur de Choiseul La Baume, who was only 17 years old, that he was very nice, that she would become the Duchess de Choiseul Stanville, and that the next day her family were coming to inform Madame de Rouchart and the Lady Abbess of the match, and she begged me to accompany her on her visits. And so that's not too bad. That seems better than some of the other matches and marriages. At least her husband-to-be is closer in age. And our footnote here, Claude Antoine Gabriel de Choiseul-La Baume, born on the 24th August 1760, was a son of the Marquis de Choiseul-Beaupré and Diane Gabrielle de La Baume de Montrevel. He was brought up at Chanteloup under the personal supervision of the Duc de Choiseul, his education having been begun by the Abbé Barthélemy. After the death of the Duc de Choiseul, who left no children, he inherited the title and peerage of that minister in consequence of his marriage with his niece. The young duke later on became governor of the Palace of the Louvre. He took an active share in the king's flight to Varnes and died in 1838. So, I mean, at least she's close in age, but if I understood that correctly, she is marrying her cousin, which I guess was acceptable and somewhat common at this time period. And where were we at? So she begged her to accompany her on her visits. It was a time-honored custom at the Abbaye aux Bois for the young girls personally to inform their companions of their marriage, and on this important occasion the betrothed was accompanied by her greatest friend. Helene, delighted at playing such an important part, prepared herself to escort Mademoiselle de Choiseul with due solemnity the following day. The next day, accordingly, in the morning, the Duke and the Duchess de Choiseul, Madame de Gramont, and Monsieur de Stanville came to the Lady Abbess's parlour, and Madame de Rouchart also came. They said that the settlements were to be signed at Versailles on the following Sunday, that on Monday the family and friends would sign them, that on Tuesday Mademoiselle de Choiseul would receive her wedding gifts, and that on Wednesday she would leave for Chanteloup, where the marriage ceremony would take place, and that 2 days after she would be brought back to the Abbaye aux Bois, as she was only 14 years of age. Directly her family had left, I went with Mademoiselle de Choiseul all through the establishment in order to announce her marriage. On Monday, the day on which the contract was signed, the whole class were looking out the windows to see Monsieur de Choiseul arrive, and he appeared to us very good-looking. All Paris was at the signing of the settlements. On leaving the parlour, Mademoiselle de Choiseul came to the window where the other pupils were, and Monsieur de Choiseul, on seeing her, made her a low bow which delighted us. She told us that her mother-in-law appeared very strict, and that it was said she was most difficult to get on with. And we have a footnote. The ceremony took place on the 10th of October 1778. The young Duchess de Choiseul had 2 children, Etienne de Choiseul, a very distinguished young man, aide-de-camp to General Berthier, who was killed in the campaign in 1807, and a daughter who married the Duc de Marmire, peer of France. The next day she received a magnificent wedding casket, bought at Mademoiselle Bertin's, a case of beautiful diamonds, jewels in blue enameling, and a purse containing 200 louis. On the day of her departure, Madame de Rouchart allowed me to go out and breakfast with Madame la Duchesse de Gramont. Madame de Clermont brought me back. Mademoiselle de Choiseul gave me a keepsake made of gold and ornamented with hair, a bag, and a fan. She distributed 40 bags and 40 fans among the pupils. It had been proposed that her sister should not go to Chanteloup, but Mademoiselle de Choiseul complained so bitterly that Madame la Duchesse consented at last to take her. She gave her sister a beautiful diamond locket, and Monsieur de Choiseul gave her a keepsake also mounted in diamonds. Mademoiselle de Choiseul, whom I shall call Madame for the future, came back at the end of a fortnight. She told me all about the festivities given her in her honour, but added that her mother-in-law had not let a single day pass without scolding her. As for her husband, she said she was madly in love with him, that he was lively and amusing, and that although they had never been left alone together, he had managed to say a great many things to her, but that she had scruples about repeating them to me. An event took place at this time which created a great impression on the young pupils at the Abbaye aux Bois. They were accustomed to be present at the ceremony of taking the veil, which was rather a frequent occurrence in the convent. It seemed quite natural to them and did not excite any painful emotion. This time, however, it was different. There had been for 2 years at the novitiate a young lady called Mademoiselle de Rastignac, who was 20 years of age. She appeared absorbed in the deepest melancholy, was constantly ill, and spent most of her time in the infirmary. She had already adopted the nun's habit, and twice had been on the point of pronouncing her vows, but each time she fell ill, and the ceremony had to be put off. Her director, Dom Thamens, urged the indefinite postponement of her vows, and it was rumoured that she was being made a nun against her will. Once we spoke to Madame de Rouchard about it, and she replied that she did not interfere in any way with the novices, but that if she thought she was being made to embrace a monastic life against her will, she would not give her vote. 2 or 3 times she was sent back to her family so as to bring her once more into contact with the world, but in vain. At last a day was fixed for the final ceremony to take place, and it was said that although she was very ill and could hardly stand, she wished to pronounce her vows. On the day of her initiation, all the Hautforts in the world filled the church, for she was their near relative. Mademoiselle de Guignes carried the wax taper and acted as her godmother. The Countess de Hautfort was her squire. She was very pretty, but first she went to the outer church and knelt down on a praying chair. Her dress was white crepe embroidered with silver and covered with diamonds. She bore up very well during the address from the Abbé de Merolles, in which he told her it was a great merit in the sight of God to renounce the world when one was made to be loved and be the charm and ornament of society. It seemed as if he took pleasure in painting a glowing picture of all that she was going to give up, but she bore it with a firm countenance. After the address, the Count de Hautfort took her hand and led her to the cloister door. As soon as she had entered it was closed upon her with a great crash. It is a way they have on these occasions. We all remarked that she turned very pale. She entered the court more dead than alive. It was said that she was ill, but it seemed to us that if her mind suffered more than her body. When she reached the choir gates, they were closed while she undressed and her worldly ornaments taken from her. She had long, fair hair. When it was let down, we were all on the point of crying out to prevent it being cut off, and all the pupils exclaimed under their breath, "What a pity!" At that moment, when the mistress of the novices put her scissors to it, she gave a start. They laid her hair on the large silver platter. It was lovely. Then they clothed her in the dress of the order, put on the veil and a wreath of white roses, after which the grating was opened and she was presented to the priest, who blessed her. An armchair was then placed near the grating for the lady abbess, who seated herself with her cross-bearer and her chaplain on either side. Mademoiselle de Rastignac knelt down before her and put her hands in hers. The formula used on taking the vows is as follows: I take the vow before God and at your hands, Madame, of poverty, humility, obedience, chastity, and perpetual reclusion, according to the rule of Saint Benoit, as observed by Saint Bernard in the order of Citeaux and the affiliation of Clairvaux. She was so weak that she could hardly support herself on her knees. The mistresses of the novices, Madame de Saint Vincent and Madame Saint Guillaume, were behind her. She seemed to have a veil over her eyes and hardly know where she was. Madame de Saint Vincent said the words of the vow, and she repeated them after her. When she had pronounced the vow of obedience and came to the vow of chastity, she made so long a pause that all the pupils, who till then had been crying, could hardly refrain from laughing. She looked on every side as if for help, so at last the mistress approached her and said, "Come, take courage, my child, accomplish your sacrifice." She gave a deep sigh at the words of chastity and perpetual reclusion, and at the same moment her head drooped on the knee of the lady abbess. It was seen that she had fainted, and she was taken to the sacristy. It is the custom that, after pronouncing her vow, she should go and kiss the knees of all the nuns and embrace the pupils, but it was said she was not well enough, and that she would only come and prostrate herself in the centre of the choir. Nothing has ever affected me more than seeing her appear at the door of the sacristy, pale as death, her eyes dim and supported by 2 nuns. Mademoiselle du Guinness, who carried her taper, was trembling so violently that she could scarcely walk. Madame Saint Madeleine, who for that was the name Mademoiselle de Rastignac had taken, advanced to the centre of the choir, where they helped her to prostrate herself. She was covered with the pall. The Misery of Lalande was sung. We also sang it, as well as the Dies Irae and the Libera of the Cordeliers, which is beautiful. It took altogether an hour and a half, as the prayers for the dead were said over her, to remind her that she was dead to the world. The same evening she had an attack of fever and was taken to the infirmary, where she remained for 6 weeks. When she left, she was appointed to the refectory, but she has not recovered her health. She remains in a state of languor which causes everybody to take an interest in her, and each one seeks to cheer her, trying to make her life as agreeable as possible. And that is the end of chapter 7.